Let's get into the basics of silver soldering. So high temperature soldering or silver soldering is an essential part of any kind of jewelry fabrication. It's much higher temperature than the type of solder being used for plumbing or pewter or something like that. One of the most common forms that silver solder comes in is wire solder. And wire solder comes typically in 3 different melting temperatures. And it's visually identical, so it's important as soon as you get your wire solder to bend the ends, and kind of a universally accepted approach is for hard solder, which melts at the highest temperature, is to bend it 3 times, so it ends up into kind of a square. And then medium solder, which melts at a temperature slightly below hard solder, you put 2 bends into. And then easy solder, which melts at the lowest temperature, you put 1 bend in. And it's essential that you have solders of different melting temperatures, because if you have a complex piece and you're going to solder to it multiple times, you don't want to heat it back up and have your previous solder seams heat up again and fall apart. So you would start with hard solder, and then as you solder more things onto your piece, move down to medium solder. And then as you complete the piece and need to add just a kind of a few final things, then you would move to easy solder. As you're setting up to solder, there are 3 major parts that will help the solder go as well as possible. One is cleanliness. So you need your solder to be clean and your metal to be clean. Also, fit is really critical. So one of my favorite sayings about soldering is that solder is not spackle. You can't just fill in big holes with solder. It flows in a very liquid state and it will not fill gaps. So it's essential that you have tightly fitting seams for your piece. And then also heat control is the 3rd essential part of a good soldering operation. And every soldering setup is a little bit different, so it's kind of a lifetime skill that you'll gain more and more experience in. So as you're starting off, don't get too frustrated. Just remember that every piece is different and that you'll learn as you go along. In setting up a soldering area, there are the most important part is to have a high temperature material that you're going to be soldering on, so you don't obviously catch your workspace on fire. This is made out of high temperature kiln brick, and then also we have another hardy backing board to protect the wall from any heat that's coming off of the torch flame as well. There are also a variety of other tools that are helpful while you're soldering, because it's very hot and then you can't touch with your hands. So we have the solder held. I like holding them in hemostats, just in case I need to add a little bit of solder while I'm soldering. Another popular tool are cross-locking tweezers that are often held in what's called a third hand, so it can stabilize the tweezers wherever you need and act as a third hand. And then often we use solder picks, which can move the solder around as necessary while you're in the middle of the soldering operation. To light your torch, you need some sort of way to create a spark to ignite the torch flame. So we typically use a little electronic sparker, but you can also use a manual striker as well, whatever suits your purposes. And while you're heating up the metal, it's essential to have flux. And flux is a material that keeps the metal clean at a higher temperature so it doesn't oxidize and those oxides get in the way of the solder flowing. So we're all set up and ready to solder. I'm going to apply just a little bit of flux on the metal. We're going to just be doing a very basic T-joint with copper here. And so I've applied flux to both surfaces, and then I'm just going to go with medium solder. And when I snip off a little bit of piece to place, sometimes it can shoot off in random directions. So I put my fingertip on the end of the wire solder and then just snip, and it'll kind of stick in the end of your fingertip just a little bit there. And that'll keep it from flying around and having to go looking for it. So then I'll just take the solder pick, place that in the middle of the seam, and typically you need much less solder than you think you will, because it's just going to flow like a liquid in a capillary action and attach the 2 metals. It's a lower melting temperature metal that flows into the gaps of the metal at a almost microscopic level, and that's what acts as kind of this glue to hold the metal together. So we've set up, we've fluxed the seam is tightly fitting, the metal and solder is clean, and we're ready to light the torch. So I have the torch, turn the torch on just a touch, strike it. An important thing about the torch flame to remember is the hottest part of the flame is not immediately next to the torch tip, but at the tip of this blue cone. So that's the optimal sort of hottest part of the flame for heating your piece. And then you can control your heat by moving your torch away from the piece as necessary. But a lot of times there's this kind of instinct to put the torch right on the piece to really heat it up, and you can see that it's not heating up this solder pick at all. It's really not optimal heating. So just past that cone is the ideal place for the most heat to place onto your piece. So we're all set. With heating this piece, you can see that the base plate is larger than the upright piece. So I'm going to focus on heating that part first. And you'll notice that the flux will boil off and sometimes move your solder pieces. And that's completely normal. So you can just kind of slide them back into place, but keep an eye on them to make sure they're exactly where you want them to be. So again, I'm focusing the heat on the base plate, and the heat will naturally sort of flow around the base plate and start heating the upright as well. But you want both pieces of metal to reach temperature at the same time. And you can see from the flux going clear that they're both reaching that temperature around the same time. And another important thing to keep in mind is that it's really the heat of the metal that's melting the solder as opposed to the torch. See the solder flowing nicely through the seam. And once it's completely flowed, you want to let it air cool, because quenching can make the solder seam a little bit more brittle. And then metals will oxidize when they're heated up, so it's important to clean the metal before you solder again or go on with any additional operations. And so what's typically used on non-ferrous metals is what's called Pickle. It's just a mild acid solution that cleans the oxides off the metal. And once you have this air cooled, you want to grab it with copper tongs, because the Pickle solution is sensitive to steel and will actually copper plate other pieces. In this case, it doesn't matter, but with silver, it would certainly matter. And you place it in the Pickle, which is commonly works better at a slightly warm temperature, and that's why it's in a crock pot. And depending on the strength of the pickle and the temperature and everything, it'll take about 3 to 5 minutes to be completely cleaned. And then you're ready to go on with additional processes on the piece. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.